I never imagined I'd get involved in something this dark. But when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you see things that change you forever. It all started at a gas station, one of those spots on the outskirts of town where you can barely see the lights from the main road. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and I was grabbing a snack when I noticed a group of guys loitering near the entrance. They had this swagger, this predatory vibe, and even though the alarms were going off in my head, I tried to mind my business. A father and his teenage son pulled up in their old pickup next to me. The son was around 17, lanky with that awkward confidence teenagers have, and the dad was just your average middle-aged guy, tired eyes, rough hands, probably worked construction or something. I was inside, paying for my chips when I heard the first shout. I turned just in time to see one of those guys shove the father back, demanding his wallet. The kid, stupidly brave, tried to intervene, but one of the bandits, this mean-looking guy with a scar across his neck, pulled a gun. What happened next still plays in slow motion in my head. There was a flash, a sound like thunder, and then the kid dropped. Just like that. No warning. The father screamed, his face a twisted mask of disbelief and horror. It wasn't just the robbery that shook me. It was the father's face, frozen in a look that I'll never forget. I stayed hidden, unable to do anything but watch the nightmare unfold. The bandits took off, laughing like they'd just pulled some sick prank. I called the cops, but it was too late. The son was dead, and the father was left to kneel in his own despair. The robbery made the local news for a day or two, but then it faded from everyone's memory, everyone except for the father. His name was Greg. And little did I know then, Greg wasn't just going to let this go. After the funeral, things got quiet, as they usually do after a tragedy. But I couldn't get it out of my head, you know. The look on Greg's face, the lifeless body of his son, it haunted me. I didn't know Greg personally, but in a small town, everyone knows someone who knows you. Word got around that Greg wasn't the same after his son's death. Obviously, how could he be? But this wasn't just grief. It was something darker. A few months passed, and I started noticing odd things. I'd see Greg around town, but not at the usual places. He wasn't at the local diner where he used to meet up with his buddies or fixing up his old truck in his front yard. No, I'd spot him in parts of town he didn't belong, the shady neighborhoods, the kind of places where you keep your head down and walk fast. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just lost in his pain, wandering around. But then I started hearing rumors. Apparently, Greg had gotten real close with some rough types. The kind of people who had connections to those bandits. Nobody said it outright, but there were whispers about him hanging out with some gang. People speculated he was losing it, maybe getting mixed up in something dangerous just to feel something again. But me? I had a gut feeling. Greg wasn't lost. He was searching. One night, I ran into one of those guys who knows things, let's call him Jimmy. He had a reputation for keeping tabs on people, especially the kind you didn't want to cross. I bought him a drink, and after some small talk, I casually asked, "Hey, you hear anything about Greg lately? That guy who lost his kid a few months back?" Jimmy gave me this long, calculating look before leaning in. "Yeah, I've heard about him. Man's been poking around places he shouldn't. Word is, he's trying to get in good with a crew. The same crew, if you know what I mean." My heart skipped a beat. "You're saying he's trying to join up with the guys who killed his son?" Jimmy smirked, took a sip of his beer. "Looks that way. They don't know it's him, though. He's playing it smart. Real patient." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Greg was infiltrating the gang that murdered his son. And from the sound of it, he was doing a damn good job. I couldn't shake the unease after my conversation with Jimmy. Greg was playing a dangerous game, but there was no way I could confront him. What would I even say? Hey, I know you're hanging with the guys who killed your kid. He'd probably either ignore me or punch me in the face. But I had to know more, so I kept an ear out for any new info. And it didn't take long before I heard something big. Apparently, Greg had integrated himself into the gang so well, they started trusting him with jobs. Small-time stuff at first, watching doors, running errands. He kept his head down, didn't make any waves. The gang, led by this guy named Tucker, a real piece of work, had no idea who Greg really was. Tucker had been there that night at the gas station, the one holding the gun, but Greg was so consumed by his own grief that night, I doubt he remembered much about any of their faces. And Tucker? He probably didn't remember Greg at all. To them, Greg was just some guy trying to get by. They called him Gray because he kept things low-key. Blended in. They didn't even know his real name. But one night, things escalated. I was sitting in a dive bar, keeping to myself, when I overheard two guys talking about a job the gang had lined up. Something big, a robbery at a jewelry store. They were going to hit it after closing, take the cash from the safe, and disappear before the alarm could trigger the cops. And guess who was going to be part of the crew? Greg. I don't know what came over me, but I felt a sick chill run through my veins. I knew this wasn't just some job for him. Greg had a plan, and I had a feeling it wasn't about the money. The pieces were falling into place. I didn't have to be a genius to figure out that Greg wasn't there to steal. He was there to finish something. A few days later, the night of the robbery finally came. I couldn't sit still. My instincts were screaming at me to stay away, but I had to see it unfold. I drove to the jewelry store and parked far enough away to not be noticed but close enough to watch. Sure enough, just after midnight, two cars pulled up. Four guys got out, Tucker, Greg, and two others. They had masks on, but I knew it was them. They broke in without a hitch, and I sat there, my stomach in knots, thinking about how this could all end. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Nothing. But then I saw movement. A figure emerged from the building, Greg. He was moving quickly, but something was off. His mask was gone, and he was covered in something dark. Blood. He was holding a bag, but it wasn't just the loot. I knew, deep down, it was all the cash they had stolen. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker, satisfaction. I watched as he threw the bag in his trunk, got into his car, and drove off into the night like nothing had happened. I sat there in my car, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Greg, quiet, grieving Greg, had just walked out of that jewelry store, covered in blood. It didn't take a genius to figure out what happened inside. This wasn't about the money. This was about revenge. The revenge he had been planning for months. I needed to know what went down inside that store. I couldn't just drive away. I forced myself out of the car, my hands shaking as I approached the darkened building. The front door was cracked open, the alarm somehow disarmed. Everything was deathly silent, except for the distant hum of the city at night. Stepping through the door, my stomach churned. The air smelled like gunpowder and blood. And then, I saw them. The gang, or what was left of them. Tucker, the leader, was sprawled near the safe, a bullet hole between his eyes. Two other guys were slumped against the counters, their bodies crumpled like rag dolls. There was no sign of struggle. No chaos. Just swift, brutal execution. Greg had been methodical, precise. It wasn't just revenge, it was cold, calculated justice. I knew it the moment I saw their bodies. Greg hadn't just killed them. He had hunted them. I stood there for what felt like forever, my mind racing. Greg had wiped out the entire crew, the same guys who had killed his son. The weight of it hit me all at once. He had spent months infiltrating them, getting close, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, he had done it. He had avenged his son's death, and he had done it so quietly that no one had seen it coming. I quickly turned and left the scene, not wanting to be caught anywhere near the bodies. I drove home in a daze, my mind trying to process what I had just witnessed. I didn't know what to do. Call the cops? They wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, what could they do now? Greg had already disappeared into the night, and there was no way they'd track him down in time. Days passed, and the news finally broke. The heist had gone wrong, they said. The gang turned on each other, a robbery gone bloody. No one mentioned Greg. His name never came up. It was like he had never been there. And maybe that's exactly how he planned it. After the news broke, I couldn't stop thinking about Greg. He had done the unthinkable, but I couldn't shake this strange feeling, part admiration, part horror. I mean, on one hand, what father wouldn't want to avenge their kid? But on the other hand, what he did, it wasn't just vengeance. It was something darker, something far more terrifying. He had planned every step, infiltrating the very gang that took his son's life, pretending to be one of them, gaining their trust, just to kill them all in cold blood. I couldn't stop picturing that night at the gas station, when I saw his son fall to the ground, lifeless. Back then, Greg had looked like a broken man, devastated and powerless. Now, he was something else entirely. He had let that grief and rage fester inside him until it transformed him into a man capable of doing the unimaginable. As the days went by, I started questioning everything. How could someone, a father grieving the loss of his son, carry so much darkness inside him and hide it so well? He had played the long game, biding his time, all while pretending to be part of that gang. He must have sat through conversations with those men, hearing them laugh, joke, and forget about the teenager they murdered. It made me sick to think about. I imagined the father Greg had been before all of this, tired from work, probably bringing home fast food for his kid, making small talk about school. A simple life. And now? Now he was a killer. Was this what he wanted for himself? Was this how he planned to honor his son's memory? I started losing sleep, haunted by the thought of what Greg must have felt in those final moments in the jewelry store. Did he feel relief? Satisfaction? Or was there a deeper, darker emptiness that followed after the deed was done? I kept replaying everything in my head. The way Greg had vanished after the robbery, like he never existed. It felt like he had just disappeared. Did he plan to vanish all along? Or did he think that killing the people responsible for his son's death would somehow bring him peace? I was torn. I didn't know whether to admire Greg's strength or fear the man he had become. Either way, one thing was clear, he wasn't the same person anymore. He had sacrificed everything, his humanity, his soul, for revenge. And for what? For justice? For closure? Or just to stop the pain that had been eating him alive since the night of the robbery? I couldn't stay out of it any longer. The weight of what I'd witnessed was too much. My conscience gnawed at me. Greg had gotten his revenge, but at what cost? I felt this urge to confront him, to understand why he went down that path, but deep down, I knew there was no good way this could end. Still, I had to see him. I needed closure, too. It wasn't hard to find him. In a small town like ours, people talk. Word was, Greg had gone off the grid, hiding out in an old cabin his family owned up in the woods. I didn't know what I'd say when I got there, but I had to at least try. So one late afternoon, I drove up to that cabin, hoping I wasn't walking into something I couldn't handle. The drive was long and eerie, the road winding through thick trees that seemed to close in on me. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked abandoned, like no one had been there for years. But then, I spotted the car tucked behind the trees, Greg's old truck. My heart raced. He was here. I got out of my car and approached the front door, my hands sweating. Before I could knock, the door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, staring at me with dead, empty eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. "Greg. I know what you did," I said, my voice shaking more than I'd have liked. He didn't react. He just stepped aside, silently inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, then followed him into the dark, cold cabin. It was bare, no sign of comfort or life, just a man who had been surviving on anger and pain. He sat down at the table, and I sat across from him, feeling the weight of the silence between us. "I saw you," I finally managed to say. "At the jewelry store." After everything, his eyes flickered, just for a second, but still, he said nothing. "I get it. They took everything from you," I continued, my voice softening. "But Greg, is this what you wanted? Is this who you wanted to become?" He leaned back, his face expressionless, but his eyes, they told me everything. He didn't need to say it out loud. This wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what he felt he had to do. "I lost him that night," he finally said, his voice hoarse and hollow. "They took my son, and I couldn't stop them. I couldn't save him," his fists clenched on the table. "I had to make sure they never did it to anyone else." I swallowed hard. "But now what, Greg? You've killed them. You've avenged your son. What's left?" He looked away, staring out the window at the trees swaying in the wind. "Nothing," he whispered. "There's nothing left," and that was it. Greg had become a ghost, a shell of the man he once was. He had gotten his revenge, but it hadn't brought him peace. It had only hollowed him out, leaving him with nothing but the memory of his son and the blood on his hands. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? There was no redemption for Greg. No going back. He had crossed a line, and now he was stuck on the other side, trapped in a life he could never escape. I stood up slowly, knowing I wasn't going to change his mind, knowing there was nothing left to do but walk away. "Take care of yourself, Greg," I said quietly, turning toward the door. He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring out the window, lost in whatever dark place he had created for himself. As I left the cabin and drove away, I realized something. Greg hadn't just killed the men responsible for his son's death. He had killed himself in the process. And the worst part? He knew it. Driving away from Greg's cabin, I couldn't shake the weight of everything I had seen, everything I had learned. Greg had gotten his revenge, but it came at a price no one should have to pay. He had sacrificed everything, his future, his humanity, his soul, all for the sake of making things right in his eyes. But was it worth it? That's the question that kept gnawing at me as I left him behind in that cold, empty cabin. Days passed, and I found myself thinking about it constantly. I wondered if Greg had found any kind of peace after what he had done. But the truth? I doubted it. Revenge is like poison, it consumes you from the inside out. And by the time Greg had finished his plan, he was already gone, replaced by something hollow, something darker. I kept my distance from the whole situation after that. The cops never figured it out, never tied Greg to the massacre. To the world, it looked like a robbery gone wrong, a bunch of lowlifes turning on each other in a greedy fight for the cash. And that's how it stayed, buried in the town's shadows, unspoken by those who knew the truth. As for me, I learned something from all of this. I learned that revenge doesn't heal anything, it just leaves scars. Greg had tried to fix his pain by hurting the people who hurt him, but in the end, he only brought more destruction. I wondered if that's how it always goes, if we're all capable of becoming someone like Greg when the world pushes us too far. I kept thinking about what I'd do if I were in his shoes. Would I have done the same? Would I have gone that far to make things right? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. But the one thing I'm sure of is this: when you go looking for revenge, you don't just lose what you love. You lose yourself. I wish I could offer some advice to anyone who's been through something similar, but the truth is, I don't know if there's a way to stop the spiral once it starts. What I can say is this: talk to someone. Don't let the anger, the pain, the grief consume you like it did Greg. Because once you start down that road, there's no turning back. If Greg had chosen differently, maybe he could have found a way to keep living. Maybe he could have honored his son's memory by living the life his boy would have wanted for him. Instead, he became the thing he hated most, a killer. I'll never forget the look in Greg's eyes that last time I saw him. That emptiness. That quiet resignation. It's burned into my memory like a brand. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that revenge isn't worth the cost. It never is. So if you're ever thinking about going down that road, ask yourself, is it really worth losing yourself over? Because Greg didn't just lose his son that night, he lost everything.